Okay, I think we can start. So very warm welcome to this morning's session in the One Planet track. So the session is called Safeguarding Our Future, Creating a Framework for Sustainability Assessments. My name is Anne-Kathrin Bock. I'm coming from the Joint Research Center from the European Commission, the Science and Knowledge Service of the European Commission, and I'm very glad to guide you through this morning. So we all know that our food system is one of the main drivers impacting sustainability. So it's generating 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's having a significant influence on biodiversity. So just to name a few of its impacts. So the question of how to effectively and quickly transform the food system towards sustainability is a major question. And for that, we need to know the status of the food system, and we need to be able to monitor progress against agreed objectives and targets. For this, we need comprehensive sustainability assessment. We need to be able to assess sustainability at different scales for different products, different processes, and we need to be able to capture and address the complexity of the sustainability transition. So in this session, we will address these questions. So we will discuss possible approaches to define a framework for this sustainability assessment, and we will also discuss how to make it operational. So what are the advantages, limitations of different approaches that already exist? What are the challenges? And how can we meaningfully combine these different approaches? And what are the methodological challenges that need to be overcome? So we have an excellent lineup of speakers this morning to shed light on these questions. We will start this morning in the first part of the session with framing the issues with contributions on the policy context and introductions to the assessment frameworks. We then have a bit of time for question and answers. And we will continue then to dig a bit deeper with several speakers looking at different uses and related opportunities and challenges of sustainability assessments. After this part, there will also be a question and answer part before we then, after the coffee break, move into a panel discussion. And the panel will explore possible ways forward towards a sustainability assessment framework. So before we move to the first presentation, I would like to remind you that there is a conference app. This is a must-have for this conference if you want to put questions, if you want to comment. So please use it. You find it on the conference website. You need your conference registration credentials for logging in. So this is the only way to ask questions, so please make use of this app. And you can use it, of course, and put questions already throughout the presentations. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session. So I'm very pleased now to come to the first speakers of this session. So we have with us today Alexandra Nikolakopoulou, who is the head of unit of the Farm to Fork Strategy Unit at the European Commission's Department for Health and Food Safety. And she's in charge of the legislative framework for sustainable food systems. I'm also happy to welcome my colleague Serenella Sala, who is joining us only remotely. She's the deputy head of unit of the Land Resource Unit at the Joint Research Center and the team leader of the Life Cycle Assessment Group. I don't think we can see her now, but we will see her once she's then giving her presentation. And with us on the stage is also Gianna Lazzarini, researcher at the Swiss Research Institute of Organic Agriculture, working in the sustainability group at the Institute, and she will be the third speaker of this morning. And without further ado, I would like now to invite Alexandra to introduce us to the legislative framework for a Union sustainable food system. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Kathrin. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would really like to start by thanking EFSA and also the co-organizing agencies, and also JRC for inviting me to share with you today the vision. I think the vision is part of the Farm to Fork strategy, but we are also talking about the vision when we refer to our key legislative proposal on a union sustainable food system. You have seen that this is called often a flagship initiative. Why? Because this initiative will translate, in fact, in law the spirit and the rationale of the Farm to Fork strategy. So I will go directly, given that I have only 10 minutes, I will start with my slides. You have heard a lot already yesterday about food system, the pressure that we have today and we will have in the coming decades also on our food system. So when we talk about food system and the approach that we take, both in the Farm to Fork strategy and the different initiatives which are now ongoing, but also in the context of the specific legislative proposal on which I will talk today, we talk about an integrated approach to the food system. This is, we all say about it, but it is not given. It is very complex, and it is something different than what we have been following so far, the linear approach of the food chain. Here we are talking about food system, and we are talking about a broad scope, having citizens in the center, which is very important because this shows that we want to link supply and demand, embracing all actors of the food system and all products which are important for the food system. Obviously, food and feed, producers, processors, retailers, but also products which are made not directly food and feed. And they are often products that we call in the periphery areas. What is also interesting is that in the Farm to Fork strategy, we are trying and we mobilize different instruments and different kinds of legislative interventions and policy interventions, rather, to achieve the goals. Not only legislative regulation, but also financial incentives, education, research and innovation, procurement, but also voluntary commitments. They have a place in this endeavor. Now, what is the overarching objective of this new framework legislation? We are talking about systemic changes. Systemic changes cannot take place without having a framework law that will set the foundations for the delivery of policy and legislation in the future. It will have an overarching scope that will address both sustainability of products, so how a given product has been produced, what are the individual attributes which are relevant for the environmental, social, economic sustainability of the product, but also sustainability of operations. It can be in terms of circularity, reduction of food waste, promotion of healthy diets. These overarching objectives, they are translated in specific objectives. I would start with the first one, to strengthen the resilience of the EU food system through transition to sustainability. This is a very relevant also objective because you are probably aware that nowadays with all the crisis that has been caused also by the by the war in Ukraine, many question the need for transition to sustainability, mainly invoking the possible costs of the transition, but also the crisis that we are currently undergoing. So these kind of shocks on the food system, they happen, they will happen also in the future, but we always have to keep in mind that we have long-term threats like the climate change, environmental pollution, that are today the biggest threat for our society and for our planet. The Farm to Fork strategy, the transition to sustainability, has to be seen as a part of the solution and not the problem. Second part of objectives, specific objectives, is how to mainstream sustainability in all food-related policies, ensure coherence of the policies at EU and national level, and create an enabling environment for future policy and regulation. Why do we have these specific objectives? Because we see today that in spite of the fact that we have an enormous legislative acquis which has made EU the highest standards in terms of food safety, and EFSA obviously has played a very important role in all this, sustainability today is not addressed in the context of our policies in a systematic and systemic manner. We have seen rather a piecemeal approach, and certain aspects of sustainability are tackled by some policies and others by other policies, but without having sustainability as a core objective of the relevant food legislation. Another specific objective is how to facilitate sustainable and healthy choices. This is key. A transition to sustainability cannot happen without a shift from consumers to sustainable diets. Therefore, it is important that this framework also sets the foundation in order to put in place a favorable food environment that will make the sustainable choice, the easy choice, the accessible choice. And last, improvement of resource management, reduction of food loss and waste. This is equally key, and it will also help mitigate some of the possible impacts that the transition to sustainability will have on the production side. When we talk about sustainability, and this is also the nice thing about the Farm to Fork strategy, is that we are talking about 3 dimensions of sustainability. We are covering both environmental, social, and economic. This is very important, and it shows that we follow indeed the One Health approach, which is also the approach which is taken today by this conference. We are discussing this issue in the One Planet session, but it could have been also discussed in One Society, in one Life. The future framework will be built around a combination of push and pull measures, meaning some building blocks, some measures that will ensure that the most unsustainable practices are taken off the market, are removed from the market, but also, given the specificities of sustainability, we need incentives to incentivize food business operators, all food system actors, to follow higher standards of sustainability. This can happen through labeling, but also through procurement. As I said, I would like to point out to the consumer's choice. This is important. It is also important in terms of methodologies that we will need in the future, because it is key to remember that transparency about the sustainability of the products, accessibility of information, and the data which have to be transmitted along the chain are very important. We should also explore the role of digitalization, how digitalization can be used to better transmit this information both along the chain but also to the consumers. Talking with this audience today, I think we should not forget that sustainability analysis is one of the principles. Today we have the risk analysis principle, but sustainability analysis does not exist today. We can raise the question, and I would be very interested also in the next presentations, and today we are carrying some open reflections whether a sustainability of analysis and assessment of products, operations, or of the entire food system would be necessary. What should be the coverage of such sustainability analysis, social, environmental, economic, and how we can combine also the different trade-offs between these three different dimensions. What should be the principles that should underpin the process for sustainability analysis? Excellence, independence, transparency. These are well-known principles that we have followed in the area of food safety. Are they relevant? Can we apply those to food sustainability assessment? And then, as I mentioned before, important ingredients that we will need in the future to implement our policy. Data, methodologies for the assessment of sustainability, the necessary expertise. Do we have in place this multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary knowledge and mechanisms which are needed? Talking about mechanisms, the governance, who should carry out such sustainability analysis and at which level? Most importantly, we need a system that will be fit for purpose. We need also scientific advice that will help the regulators to deliver policy in this area. So just a few words, this is my last slide. We are in the process of preparation of this proposal. Consultations will be carried out and have been already started, and we will have many workshops also with the stakeholders as of September. Very interesting also, we had a workshop with all agencies just a few weeks ago. And we are looking forward to your contributions. So I think that these were the slides to set the scene, and I'm looking forward to the next presentations and the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for indeed excellently setting the scene for the discussions and spelling out a bit the needs and the framework of any sustainability assessment. So we're now coming to our next speaker, which is Serenella, who will talk about the components and operationalization of a framework for sustainability assessment. Please, Serenella, the floor is yours, and she is remotely connected, so she should come online and become visible very soon.
Thank you, and Catherine. Can you hear me?
Yes, works. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm really honored to be here today with you, even if remotely, unfortunately. But I would like to propose you a reflection on the components and operationalization of a framework for sustainability assessment. The idea is together to analyze which are the main sustainability principles that should be, let's say, the building blocks of a framework, and to discuss some key features of the approaches needed for sustainability assessment. And I will give you a couple of examples, one more on a qualitative side, the No SDG platform launched by the JRC, and another more on a quantitative approach, that is the consumption footprint food platform of the JRC. So the Commission, over different mandates, has really enshrined the sustainability concept, and two main building blocks are the fact that this is rooted in the Sustainable Development Goals, but also in the need that we are defining policies that are fostering a life of dignity for all, so a social and economic focus within the planetary boundaries. So it's very clear in several Commission initiatives that these are the two main elements of what is conceived as sustainability in our policymaking. Actually, when we want to design a framework for sustainability, what we have to ask ourselves is if the ambitions of this kind of policy initiatives on the SDG and on the need of remaining within planetary boundaries has been achieved or not. So for many of the evidence that we have, and also the megatrends that we are experiencing, the answer is not. Just I give you a small example. To remain within the planetary boundaries for climate, we are asked to, as an average citizen, to do not emit more than 1 ton of CO2 per year, while an average EU citizen today is at 10 tons. So this is just to give you an idea that the magnitude of the effort to be put in place, it's quite significant. And this is embracing not only environmental elements, but as Alexandra mentioned, also socio-economic challenges ahead of us. So the first question is really what is to be sustained and what to be developed. Because on one end, we want to sustain nature. We want to sustain what nature is giving to us, so the so-called life support, the ecosystem services and functions, but also the resources and the quality of the environment. But also we want to sustain the communities. And with communities, it's really a large concept in which we have the culture, the group, the places, the human capital that we have. On the other hand, we have what is to be developed. So in our development goals, we have people, economy, and society with ambitions of fairness, of welfare, of health-related and life expectancy-related elements. Now, these two elements are connected by another type of questions, which are related to the temporal ambition, because you might have different type of intervention if you are thinking to do a quick fix with a short time frame or something that has to be long-standing, but also elements of the scale. We might have issues that are very dramatic at local scale, but then at global scale are considered not so relevant, and the other way around, that you might have situations that actually we are generating and that at the global scale are creating particular challenges. So this is part of what we have to ask ourselves when we design a framework. And then we have to be very transparent and clear on the underpinning sustainable development principle. For example, the irreversibility concept, that we want to have interventions that keep us far from irreversible changes, or the issue of focusing on future generations, so the current generation and the future generation right to, for example, access resources or have an healthy environment. So these are, let's say, elements of theoretical frameworks. But then what is exactly a framework? So if we start looking at what we can define as framework, basically is the rationale and the structure that we are using to evaluate the different components of the sustainability. So this framework should be coherent with the scientific and social paradigm, so the specific context in which the evaluation is conducted. And as I mentioned before, to be very transparent on the concept and the guiding principles. Then the framework is composed of certain elements that also Alexandra mentioned before. So we have to identify which are the methodologies we want to put in place for the evaluation, and those can be qualitative, semi-quantitative, or quantitative. And for example, risk assessment, life cycle assessment, other type of integrated assessment might be needed there. And then we might need to have a coherent set of methods, models, tools, and indicators to reflect the coherence of the framework and the methodological choices. So the frameworks to be might have different characteristics. They can be purely conceptual. They can be operational in the sense that for specific dimension of sustainability, we are already providing in the framework which are the methods and approaches we are using to measure this dimension. But to be really complete, they need to be complemented with a clear way in which trade-offs are assessed, in which decisions are taken. So in which the way in which the different indicators are combined and the final decisions are taken. So if we now look into the methods for sustainability assessment, they have key features that has to be identified and that again characterize them. So the first of this feature is basically related to the comprehensiveness. So as Alexandra mentioned before, we want to move from something that is monodimensional to multidimensional, so to embrace the different pillars of the sustainability. Then we want that to be integrated, so to go towards transdisciplinarity, that is not just an integration, but is also fostering the stakeholder involvement. Then we need elements that are addressing the scalability, so approaches that can take into account local intervention, micro intervention, so at the local scale or at product scale, but that are able then to see the implication at the system scale. And this is quite strategic then for the other point, which is the strategicness, because we have to move from approaches that are only looking at the account, so accounting of indicators to say and monitor the situation, towards change-oriented approaches that are helping identifying the direction of the changes, that are helping to operationalize the optimization of the systems that we are evaluating. And then the last 2 points that are quite important. The first is the transparency. So a good sustainability assessment approach should not be a black box. The underpinning values and underpinning principles should be transparent. And then the last point is it has to be boundary oriented. So it's important that the element of the constraints, like the planetary boundaries, or the elements of the target in terms of socioeconomic performance should be taken into consideration and evaluated. So looking at that seems quite complex. Actually, we need a blend of different approaches to monitor, to assess, and to design the sustainable solutions. And these, as I mentioned before, need a mix of qualitative approaches like complex system science that are more conceptual evaluation of the systems, storytelling, foresight exercise, combined with modeling approaches, modeling of the environmental, the social, and the economic system. And life cycle assessment approaches in these are very promising because they are embracing the possibility of modeling socioeconomic system and to then evaluate impacts not only on the environment but also on the social domain. And the JRC has some examples of this type of approaches. One is a qualitative approach via the No SDG platform, which is a platform designed to assess the possible link between policy intervention and sustainable development goals, the interlinkages between the sustainable development goals and the synergies and trade-off, and then a quantitative platform, which is the consumption footprint, which is a platform based on life cycle assessment. So just to have a better idea of the No SDGs platform, as I mentioned, this is really meant to support the evaluation of how to concretely align policies and programs to the Agenda 2030 and its goals. And the idea here is to enable in policy development and in policy impact assessment what is asked by the better regulation. So understanding the extent to which policies in EU are supporting, are creating synergies to the achievement of the SDG. And we are now involved in a work specifically focusing on the framework legislation for the Farm to Fork that was mentioned before, to identify which are the main SDG at stake, what is the literature, what is the, let's say, scientific evidence on the link between the SDG and the different policy intervention. And we are really trying to identify them and define a narrative for this. As I mentioned then, beyond the qualitative approach, we need to move to quantitative approach, and I will focus on the application of life cycle thinking, mainly for two reasons, because it's an example of embracing entirely supply chain, but as we said before, it's not just that we have to look at supply chain, we have to look at the entire system of actors in the food system, and this is something that could be enabled by this type of approaches. And the other element is really in relation to the identification of the trade-off. So being able to have multiple indicators for the evaluation, and then to see if we are maybe able to reduce on the climate on one end, if we are not creating then trade-off on the toxicity side or on the resource side. The life cycle assessment has been discussed in several contexts as really a possible enabler of the assessment of SDG, the quantitative assessment of SDG, because it's possible, for example, to model what is in the framework of the SDG 12, so in responsible production and consumption, and then to see on the right the possible implication on environmental related SDG, and on the left, maybe it's reverse for you, sorry, on the social related SDG applying social life cycle assessment approaches. And of course, with these kind of approaches, we can also map the so-called impact categories of the life cycle, so the impact elements that we are looking at with the SDG, but also with the planetary boundaries. So it's really a way to integrate and connect the dot between different ambitions in sustainability assessment framework. And basically, we developed at the GRC a platform to operationalize this kind of exercise. The platform is covering different areas of consumption, including food. The exercise is now based on 45 food products that represent more than 85% of the consumption of food in Europe. The modeling of this product is combined with the consumption intensities, so gathering different type of statistics and sources for the assessment of the evolution of the consumption pattern in Europe, and then is translated in 16 different environmental impact categories, and is also the basis for an evaluation of the possible contribution to biodiversity footprint of the food system. And this is helping us to have quantitative insights on the role of food across the different areas of consumption, so the relevance of the food, then the evolution of the food impact over time, and in the last 10 years, the impacts were increased of 30%, and they were mainly driven by meat-related and animal-based product consumption. And also to have an idea how much we are overcoming, transgressing planetary boundaries, because the European food system alone is already transgressing 3.6 times the planetary boundaries for the overall consumption. So it's quite a striking result. And as I said, it's possible also to map these products with the contribution to the SDG. So to see which SDGs are hit the most, and also which are the type of food products that are contributing the most to that. And this is very much helping then identifying that we have a direction to take, basically in the combination of an healthy diet and an healthy planet together. So to come up to some conclusion, it's clear that when we want to discuss a framework for sustainability and in the remit of sustainability science, we have to look really for change orientation, so it's solution-oriented approaches, and that we need really to combine qualitative and quantitative approaches, like the two examples I made, the one on the no SDG platform and the second on these consumption footprints. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope this will stimulate debate on what is needed for the framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serenella, for outlining the challenges that are linked to creating a sustainability assessment framework, and already some examples of possible ways forward. We will now hear from our next speaker, Gianna Lazzarini, about a global attempt towards a sustainability assessment framework. It's a reference framework called SAFA, Sustainability Assessment of Food and Agricultural System. And she will also talk a bit about one application of it. Please, Gianna.
Yes, so thank you for the introduction. I work at the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture, and I just quickly want to mention it because maybe some of you don't know it. Yes, we are based in Switzerland, but we have several offices around Europe, and since 5 years we also have a Feeble Europe, we call it, here in Brussels. So if you're interested in any work we do, please contact us in the nearest office. So I'll just start with my topic. What we are interested in our group, in the sustainability group at Feeble, is the sustainability of agri-food chains, and often sustainability hotspots of these chains are located at the farm level. So we focus on the farm sustainability, and farm sustainability depends on various factors. So first of all, it depends what they're actually producing. So in this case, we have a farmer producing cocoa and another one producing milk. So these are really different systems already. But also it depends on the conditions, so the climatic conditions, the geographic location. So maybe this farmer is in agroforestry or located in a forest. This one maybe is in the Swiss mountains where I come from. But it also depends what methods, what practices are used. So is it an organic farm, or is it an agroecological farm? Is it a conventional farm? What tools are used? How mechanized it is? So there are many, many factors influencing the sustainability on the farm. And to assess this, the FAO developed these SAFA guidelines. The aim was to harmonize these assessments for agriculture and food supply chains. Yes, and it consists of 4 dimensions. So normally you hear about the 3 dimensions. What they add is the good governance, which in our case is on the farm level, but if you go along the supply chain in each institution or in each branch, the idea is that you have a good governance that is also important for sustainability. The others, I think you know, the environmental integrity, it's called economic resilience and social well-being. We talked, or people yesterday talked a lot about health, so the whole health issues would be in the social well-being, of course. Yes, and in these 4 dimensions, we have several themes, 21, and these themes are then divided into sub-themes. In the framework, the objective and descriptions are included, and some example indicators, but it's really only examples. And what we did at Feeble is to take this theoretical framework and put it in practice so that we can actually assess sustainability on farms. We developed this tool, and we have a software which we use, and with this software, that's the normal process we do. We import some already existing data for the farms that we want to study. Yes, and then when we have the first information, we go on the farms in our farm visits and conduct interviews with the farmers to get all the information we need. Then in the software, we can analyze and evaluate the results. And in the end, we can produce some reports on one hand for the farmers, so on the single farms, so that they see how sustainable they are, or maybe better where their hotspots are and where they're already pretty good, but also to summarize maybe the results of a whole project for over all the farms within the project. Yes, so this it looks when we go assessing sustainability on the farms. It's a lot of paperwork sometimes as well, but we also really visit the farm. We note all the observations we make about how the animals are kept in the stables, and yes, all kind of things. What pesticides we see standing around. But yeah, most of it is asking questions to the farmers and putting them into the tool. Yeah, it takes some time actually, 4 hours normally for a farm, but it really depends. I mean, there are really complicated farms with a lot of branches. Of course, there we have more questions. If there's a simple farm that does only one thing, it goes a little bit faster. Yes. So then, with all this information, we combine them with these indicators. So we have over 300 indicators, and these are linked to the different subthemes from this SAFA subtheme. And indicators can, of course, influence several subthemes. I will show you an example later. So we have 1,700 links or more. Also, it always depends on the farm. I mean, if a farm doesn't have animals, of course, all the things related to animal well-being are excluded because it doesn't make sense that we assess this. Yes, but on average, we have 30 indicators per subtheme. You see there are some that have a lot more, especially in the environmental and economic part. And then we have weighted indicators. So yeah, this is a whole process I can explain to you in another setting maybe, but based on expert knowledge, we introduce the weighting of these indicators for the different subthemes. And yeah, this is how we calculate the subthemes, and also the theme is then the average of the subtheme values. So here is an example, so maybe you can imagine a little bit better what this means. So let's say we have an indicator, child labor, and this child labor influences several subthemes. So of course the subtheme child labor, but also employment relations, quality of life, and workplace safety. Yes, and then we have a question, which is of course only asked if there are children working on the farm, but then we ask, okay, is there a risk that the performance of the children at school is hampered by this? And then we also have sometimes examples like, well, are they tired, or they're not able to do their homework? Yes, so this is the question that the assessor, also the enumerator, sees. How he asks it then to the farmer is a whole other level, because of course, asked like this, most people will say no. Yes, but then there are the different answers: yes, no, not relevant. And yeah, not relevant is if there are no children working there. All right, so this was the example and for the questions, and I wanted to show you some results, how it looks in the end, and I tried to do this directly with projects we recently did. So one project was about cocoa in the tropics. You see, these are the 4 dimensions, and here are the different themes, and here that's in percentage the goal achievement from 0% to 100. So of course, if you're around 100, it's green, and if it's around 0, it's red. And here in this example, you see cocoa production from 195 farms in Ecuador. And you see, which we have in most projects, that the variance is really high. So you have, for some sub-themes, themes, you have big differences between the worst farm and the best farm. On the other side, in the second part, you see the comparison of the median for this Ecuadorian case, and we also assessed 200 farms in Uganda. And if you compare then the median, you see really similar results or pattern. So you see, okay, the cocoa production, it doesn't really matter if it's in Ecuador or in Uganda, at least in what we assessed. The patterns are really similar, and you can assess the hotspots where, yeah, work should be done maybe first, maybe labor rights, yeah, fair trading practices. I guess these are the topics we all know about. Just to have another example to finish, in Europe we also do a lot of case studies. Here we have 2 kind of livestock farming systems. The first one is a Swiss case study with specialized and mixed livestock farm, and the second one a Czech case study with dairy farms. And also here you can see maybe that, I mean, there are differences between the 2 countries, but the pattern also here is similar. So they're both cattle farms or mixed livestock farms, and the topics or the hotspots are similar for both case studies. Yes, so this is just to summarize it a little bit. I think it's a good method to have an overview on what is going on the farm, but there's always a starting point to identify hotspots and then go further. If you're interested in this method and also many other methods we do at our institute, you can contact me or directly other people at FIBL. And yes, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gianna, for this, for complementing the picture on the sustainability assessment, the possibilities we already have today. Do we still have time for a couple of questions? Because we're running a bit late, so yes, we do. And we already got some, so I might remind you about using the app for putting questions to our speakers. So this is the only way to make your questions heard in this conference. So we have here a question from Joachim Rutters about the land use, and that might, one that Serenella might want to take. So is land use also part of the determination of sustainability? Because often the more environmentally sustainable food production has a higher land use per food unit. I don't know if Serenella is still with us. Yeah?
Yes,
okay.
I'm here. I think you can hear me, so I can reply. I don't know if you hear. Okay. Yes, no, land is actually one of the key components because the resources are that are assessed are water, mineral and metal resources, and land, so soil-related resources. The assessment is modeling really what is the use of the land, but also the possible implication for soil health and, let's say, soil ecosystem services in a broader concept.
Thank you. Another question is about sustainability relation to risk assessment. Is sustainability just another facet in risk assessment? And what role could EFSA play? I don't know, one of you would like to take it?
Yes, I would say at the moment, risk assessment is defined mainly in relation to health, and we also see environment considerations as part of the risk assessment. We cannot say that sustainability in the current legislative framework is part of the risk assessment. And this is what we have been discussing, and we should discuss how sustainability could be part of the risk assessment, whether we need a new definition of risk or a parallel process for the assessment of sustainability. So, yeah, at the moment I would say, no, it is not, but we are in a process of evolution in the legislation.
Thank you. I think I have another question that is also for you. No, the one on the impact assessment. No. So the comprehensive impact assessment and the question for clarity on the process that the Commission is using.
Yeah. This is a recurrent request by many about cumulative impact assessment. Here, I would just like to reiterate the position of the Commission. We did not carry out a cumulative impact assessment of the farm to fork strategy. The farm to fork strategy is not a legislation, it is more a direction of travel of what we have to do in order to accelerate the transition to sustainability. The Commission is carrying out individual impact assessments for each of the initiatives, trying also in the assessment to take into account the existing legislation, but also ongoing initiatives which are all run in parallel. We develop also a monitoring framework with new indicators, because at the moment we do not have sufficient indicators for all dimensions of sustainability, especially when it comes to health, many on environmental. Plus, it is foreseen that the Commission will make a mid-term review of the farm to fork strategy in 2023. So that's it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. And One question directed to Gianna. Very concrete question. So what determines the weighting you give to the criteria in your different categories?
Yes, so, well, actually that was a whole research process as well. We did this kind of called Delphi process with, I think, 64 experts. So experts in different fields had to define their weightings in their view, how the different factors or indicators influence the different themes. And based on this, this was done in several phases. So they had a first assessment, and then they discussed it, and then they could re-evaluate. And based on this, we did our weightings. So yeah, if you're interested, I can also give you a publication on that whole thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And then we have a question indeed linked to the Common Agriculture Policy. So does the Commission have plans for including sustainability elements in the CAP, and to link also the Sustainable Use Directive for pesticides with the CAP?
I think so.
Okay.
The new CAP that was adopted 2 years ago contains already many elements to accelerate the transition to sustainability comparing to the previous one. So we see components about organic food, promotion of organic, to incentivize also uptake of agroecology, of eco-schemes. The eco-schemes also are an important element in the CAP. And I would also like to highlight the whole mechanism of the national action plans that the Commission has put in place, asking member states to submit national action plans that also take into account the priority areas and the targets of the Farm to Fork strategy, being the reduction of pesticides, reduction of fertilizers, increase of organic and antimicrobial resistance, and food waste. So I would say that yes, all this is very much considered. The ambition could have been higher. The negotiations were quite tough in the CAP, but yes, today also we will have the adoption of the revised proposal of the Sustainable Use Directive of pesticide, and we have to see also whether any links with the CAP also are highlighted in this proposal.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I see we still have 2 minutes left. A question on the current LCA methodology and the studies. They tend to favor high input intensive agriculture systems and misrepresent less intensive ecological systems, including organic agriculture. How can this be taken into account in the future sustainability assessment, seeing that the EU is also pushing for more organic agriculture? I don't know, Serenella, would you like to take that?
Yes, I think this is a very good question, and this is also where the Commission and the activities on the LCA development are now really concentrated to be able to address better this kind of issue that concern, for example, a wider biodiversity assessment that is able to identify benefits of low input agriculture and model them in a better manner. So especially the work that is now ongoing for the environmental footprint and its refinement is really looking at that. In any case, one element is again the possibility of integrating assessment that is very often conducted at local scale, like at field scale or in a specific context and region, with instead an evaluation that is embracing an entire supply chain, and we are experiencing more and more supply chain which has a global nature, so quite complex. So, but yes, the answer is there is a specific work to address this issue.
Thank you very much. And I think we now have to stop here with the questions and move to our next panel, to part 2 of this session. A big thank you to the speakers, and a big round of applause would be nice. And I would like now to invite our next speakers on the stage for a session, for the part of the session where we look more into practical considerations of sustainability assessment frameworks and related opportunities and challenges. So we have, for that part, we have Antoine Messéan with us. He is research manager at the French National Institute for Agriculture, Food and the Environment, INRAE, so this is certainly known to many people. And he has been looking into environmental risk assessment of GM plants. We have remotely with us, remotely connected, Xenia Trier, lead expert on chemicals, environment and human health at the European Environment Agency. And she's in particular dealing with the safe and sustainable by design concepts. So I hope we see her later when she gives her talk. And we have also here with us in the room Ansel Renner, researcher at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And he's focusing on accounting methodologies for the holistic assessment of socio-ecological systems under change. So as before, the setup is that we will hear from the 3 speakers, and then there will be time for questions and answers. Again, please use the app, put your questions, put your comments, so that we have them at the end of the talks in our question and answer session. And without further ado, may I invite you, Antoine, to take the floor and discuss the criteria, opportunities, and challenges of sustainability assessments of agriculture systems.
Thank you, Anne-Catherine. I would like to come back to the point made during the question and answers about the link between sustainability assessment and risk assessment of regulated projects and how we can articulate them, knowing that the global assessment is taking into consideration large-scale and long-term dimensions, while by definition the environmental risk assessment of a regulated product like GMO or pesticides are very much innovation centers. So, and the issue is that in practice, the transitions won't be made by a single innovation. So we have to combine a series of nature-based or technology-based innovations. And for example, yesterday, Jessica Fanzo mentioned the need to move towards more diversified systems. And you see in this meta-analysis that this agricultural diversification at large and crop diversification, meaning crop diversity, more crop, more legumes, intercropping, genetic diversity, could contribute to several ecosystem services. And but the point is that, so it's quite complex. It's not just one solution that would fit all cases, especially in the context of agroecological transitions, where now instead of using external inputs, we are exploiting the interactions with the receiving environment, so biological regulations, more diversification. So solutions should be tailor-made to local context. On top of that, climate change and also economic shocks are creating more uncertainties. And therefore, we have to move from current systems, that are already more or less diversified, to more diversified systems. But we don't know where we will be getting there because of this uncertainty under these external drivers, and also because of the need to adapt to local context. So this system approach, coming back to the environmental risk assessment of regulated project, is already foreseen in the regulation. For example, here you have for the guidance document on environmental risk assessment of GM plants, such a statement that we need to assess the direct and indirect, immediate and delayed effect of the GM plant, on the receiving environment. And also to consider indirect effect linked to the change in management. And so, what does that mean for the, but the fact is that this is a real challenge to consider this system approach, while, as I said, we are talking about one single innovation. And to do that, we are using a comparative assessment within EFSA, where we compare a GM plant with a conventional plant, and we check whether they differ apart from the threat which had been introduced. And then we focus the assessment on the new threats. And this can lead to conclusion like, well, the GM event, the GM plant, X, Y, Z, is as safe or unsafe as its conventional counterpart. But of course, this strategy relies on the assumption that the interactions with the receiving environments are limited. And we know that with the agroecological transitions, it's not the case, that we will have more and more interaction to consider. And why? Because when you focus your assessment on the given innovation, how can you extrapolate to the behavior in the receiving environment, knowing that you've got out there a lot of stressors, factors that may interact. Just an example which is illustrated here in the case of a pesticide. This is a simulation study done in Denmark, where the outcome of the ERA, so the direct effect on the reproduction of eggs, has been upscaled at the landscape level, so 10 landscape. And you see that for these two criteria, occupancy and abundance, the outcomes is very different. So based on that, how come you can decide whether or not a given effect is acceptable while you have such a diversity out there? So this is the first challenge. And another example is the impacts of BT maize at the landscape level on the mortality of non-target Lepidoptera. So taking into account and the maize allocations, the percentage of maize, the crop management, pollen dispersal, but also the behavior of insects. And the outcomes may be very different. So we need to move for a qualitative, no risk, or there is a risk, to a much more quantitative approach. On top of this upscaling of direct effect, you also have indirect change in management. So it's not linked to the innovations, to the related product as such. For example, here you have a study carried out 20 years ago in the UK, farm scale evaluations, where herbicide-tolerant crops, so beet, maize, and oilseed rape, have been compared with their conventional counterparts in a series of field at the field level and over 3 years. And the outcome is that while there was no difference between the GM plant and the non-GM plant as such in terms of crop development, the change in herbicide regimes has led to drastic change in the biodiversity, reductions for oilseed rape. You see the HT versus the non-HT. And similarly, for the additional, it's not just the change of herbicide regimes when you introduce HT crop. You also change, this has been observed in the US, more adoptions of minimum soil tillage and shorter rotation. And this has more effect here in a simulation study on the series of indicators where there is almost no change if you just switch, keep the same rotations, while then you consider changes in rotations, you have much bigger change. So how can we articulate this global sustainable assessment? So we have to consider that in principle, whenever you are in the risk assessment, try to estimate, predict what would be the impact of such a regulated product in the systems, considering all interventions, the ecosystem, ecological processes, ecosystem services, and at the end of the day, the Sustainable Development Goal. So one way where we have done that is using the similar tool that we have been discussed so far with this DEXI or MASK decision tree, hierarchical, where you try to combine to assess what would be the impact of a coping system or of a specific innovations in a given context. And so this is what if, and you can do also the other way around, considering that you have specific goals to achieve, and then what would be the best combinations of context and cropping system that would reach. So that's one way to put into context the given innovations, because it's mission impossible, of course, to consider all other stressors. And this kind of tools, and similar to those already presented today, has been used in a participatory approach with farmers. So you have dashboard, and then to improve. So you start with the current situations, you introduce your new practices, and you see how it propagates throughout the tree up to the overall sustainability assessment, and then you can step-by-step approach. That can be done ex ante. And of course, given the diversity of a receiving environment, given the fact that everything is changing anytime, we need to develop monitoring and to articulate the pre-market risk assessment with the post-market risk assessment, where we would have to use, and of course it's much more global, because post-market should consider all possible stressors, and then try, if you observe differences, changes in the environment, find out which kind of innovations might explain, and then you move back to the risk assessment. Of course, this kind of framework would need changes in policy, in regulations to adapt. For example, the pesticide and the GM regulations are still quite separated, while we see that it's not possible to separate. And of course, from the scientific point of view, we still have to develop tools to make this kind of framework operational. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Antoine. We now come to our next speaker, Xenia, who will talk about designing safe and sustainable by design chemicals and products.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this EFSA 1 conference. And I'm very pleased to join, even if I'm joining remotely from Copenhagen. We are doing this for sustainability reasons, so we are trying to limit our CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. And I also want to give a warm thanks to the organizing team, Angelo Majora and Jan de Vos and the others, for really setting up this great conference and starting this discussion. So I'll be talking today about designing safe and sustainable by design chemicals, materials, and products. And I want to start with looking at the policy context. Why do we have safe and sustainable by design? Why are we discussing it? Well, as has been mentioned before, we have multiple challenges related to the planetary boundaries, and that is acknowledged in the European Green Deal, where we have to achieve multiple goals at the same time to prevent pollution, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, and climate change, and all at the same time. We then have a number of strategies, and one of them is the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability from October 2020, that calls out to avoid harm of chemicals to planet and the people. And this means from all chemicals and stressors to reduce the absolute harm that was also mentioned by Serenella related to these planetary boundaries. And one of the tools to achieve that is to prevent pollution by an industrial transition to safe and sustainable by design. And this is illustrated in the CSS by this triangle here showing that the key focus should be on prevention. And prevention is, in this context, also thought to be promoting the use of safe and sustainable chemicals, materials, and products. So we can get away from the situation where we create harm and then we have to eliminate and remediate it after it has happened, which sometimes is impossible because some of the harms are irreversible. So in the context of the CSS, what are the methodological requirements? Well, once again, preventing harm from of chemicals to planet and people calls out for addressing harm on multiple dimensions. We have the safety, thought as of toxicity to humans, ecosystem health, and we also heard that covers both ecotoxicity, but also land use and biodiversity. Resources to reduce the use of resources and increase circularity and climate change. And then in the CSS actually does not call out for the social and economic dimensions, even if these are addressed in other parts of the European Green Deal, such as the just transitions, and also, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. It also calls to be proactive and by avoiding the use both of known and suspected substances of concern. And it has a particular focus on the persistent chemicals that accumulate. Because these chemicals, once they get into the environment, it's irreversible typically, and we also would lose the molecules because they are not mineralized and therefore they don't enter the circularity. And this can be illustrated by showing the situation where we have some chemicals we know that are harmful, some that are persistent, some that are benign, and a lot where we don't know the properties of them. And we want to move from a situation where we have a certain amount to where we have a lower fraction of those chemicals used. And then coming back to this point about reducing the absolute harm, which is really linked to the carrying capacities, and thanks to Serenella for really giving a good overview of all these concepts and how it links to the environmental systems, that we live on a finite planet where we want to reduce the absolute harm. And that means that we really have to also think about, can we reduce the absolute use of these chemicals? So not just the fraction, but the overall use, the amount. And that calls also for designing products and chemicals and materials that are designed to be both reused and recycled. And to achieve that, we need to reduce the complexity of the products, because we heard it's really a complex system out there. So the one thing that we can do is that the products we make, we reduce the complexity of them. That allows us better to assess them, but also to reuse the materials. So in 2021, at the EA, we produced a web briefing on safe and sustainable by design. And this is something that is applied at the pre-market, so really by industry. And here we present the conceptually how that could be achieved. It starts from a multidisciplinary design of the product, where we want to set up a process where the different people involved in the design are talking with each other. That would be the material chemist, chemists, toxicologists, industrial designers, and people along the supply chain, maybe even the CEO. And in the very first step, we want them to avoid chemicals of concern, which was really this preventative approach. And this is also one of the proposals of the current JRC report that calls out to having a two-step approach, where you in the first step, avoid substances of concern, and in the second step, you go through the life cycle assessment. But it really starts with looking at the service of the product. That could be a service, for instance, pest control, which can achieve by various means, use of chemical pesticides, physical removal, and biological methods. However, if we only focus on the chemicals and materials, we limit ourselves in the innovation process. For instance, we might limit ourselves to drop-in chemical substitution. And this is why we think it's important to look at both also the products and the processes as well. And then from there, it goes through various steps where you define the life cycle of the chemical or material or product. That allows you to give an overview of the impacts that can happen along this life cycle and to assess these impacts on these 4 protection dimensions. And then you can assess the candidates and compare them with some criteria, and then finally select the candidates to produce. So taking a little bit closer look at the assessment stage. Well, once again, we need to meet the sustainability goals without compromising safety or any of the other dimensions. And therefore, we think it's important to set a minimum score that avoids burden shifting. So you don't have really good performance in one thing, but then you kind of lose out on another thing. This, we think, is really key to create trust in the SSBD concept. We also think that it's important to set the protection goals based on a societal discussion of what we want to achieve and also informed by the planetary boundaries. And that allows you to give the total score. So how can we achieve this? Well, it's a long path, and we think we need to create an enabling environment, focusing on policies, not just related to research, even though that is a really good start, but also looking at policies on chemicals, products, and investments that really motivate the transition to safe and sustainable by design. We think here that, for instance, having SSBD covered in the sustainable finance criteria might be a good way to start, and we already see that those discussions happening. Next, we need to change the way that we think. We need to design differently. And here we think it's not enough, again, just to talk with chemists. We also need to talk with the material engineers, the designers, the supply chain, everybody who's involved in the design of these products. And we need to support that process once you are starting to implementing SSBD by having some technical support centers, because as we saw, the methodologies can be really complex and perhaps not all SMEs or farmers even have that knowledge. So we need somebody to support that. And we think that development of compliance methods is really important. So it's standardized, it's trustworthy, and it creates a level playing field. So trustworthy is key, and also the methodologies, we need them to be, let's say, understandable and implementable. We can start with existing methodologies. We already saw there's a lot out there, but we also need to get started. And perhaps this is where there are some hard choices to be made, because if we wait until it's perfect, we might wait for a long time and we will not have, let's say, action really soon. So perhaps we can start with the simple approaches of what we know already now, such as avoid substances of concern, and then add on the elements of sustainability when they're ready. We think that it's key to expand the methods and models, both for life cycle assessment, also to generate environmental monitoring data to validate the models, to ensure access to the data and statistics that we need to fill in the models. And then we need to have standardized methods to do the gap filling, because we know that we will not have all the data. And again, this is key to create trust in the SSBD methodology. Then we need to educate and involve the stakeholders, not just in science, but along the supply chain, so people have trust in these methods and see a need for it. And we need to educate a lot of different stakeholders on methodologies and also on the interdisciplinary design process, because working together is also something we have to do across different dimensions. And finally, these methodologies need to be implementable. So we need to have something that is fast and cost efficient for compliance methods to show compliance with SSBD claims. That can create a level playing field, both for European but also imported products and the technical support centers to assess the businesses. And finally, we need strong incentives for the broad uptake. We think that a research agenda is really good start, but maybe this is not enough to create a broad uptake across industries. We need some sticks and carrots. So the sticks could be legal obligations. The carrots could be financial incentives. but also a public and private procurement commitments to make sure that those who actually go through a safe and sustainable by design, they have a market of preference. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening. And once again, I think that actually what we have started here in collaborating across different dimensions, environment and food systems, and that really great exchanges of knowledge and learning from each other with EFSA and the EA and the other partners is really the way to go, and it's a good start to address the sustainability issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Xenia, also for pointing out the importance of collaboration to foster sustainability and the notion of urgency of moving forward and not waiting until systems in place are perfect. So we now move to our last speaker of this part, is Ansel. He will talk about system scale sustainability assessment based on societal metabolism and scenario analysis.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to start with the aim of this presentation. And one of the central aims is about moving on from conventional analyses to sustainability, such as those emphasizing inputs and outputs, towards the lens of societal metabolism and the toolkit that implies. So I'd like to start with an assertion, which is that the economy is not about producing goods and services. Rather, the economy is about reproducing the fund elements, per se, required to both produce and consume goods and services. So a fund element is a stable biophysical element of the system. It has a metabolic profile. This could be an organ, for example. For you and me, this is maybe a heart or a kidney or a liver. For a social economic system, this could be, for example, a sector. So let me visualize that. This is one way of breaking down a social economic system into 5 different sectors: household and service and government on the upper part, and then manufacturing, construction, energy and mining, and agriculture on the lower part. In metabolic jargon, we call these first 2 sectors, same as for you and me, catabolic. They're about putting to use and breaking down resource gradients. And then the bottom 3 sectors, including agriculture, are anabolic. They're about building up the body of the social economic system. So these are fund elements, per se, organs of society. At a lower level, we can also associate them with a fund element, which is human activity. We could also add here power capacity, land use, and so forth. This is one example to illustrate the approach. Human activity is reproduced in the household sector. A part of that goes back into the household sector, physiological overhead, and then a certain fraction goes into the other 4 sectors. This is your labor, informal. And then when we're doing a food system analysis, focusing here on agriculture in its relation and its context within the other sectors within the system, we can start adding different metabolic throughputs. So for example, animal products and vegetable products. Of course, at a lower scale, we could add many more items, many additional ones. So agriculture produces this animal and vegetable products or what have you with distinct supply systems, livestock production, plant production, and so forth, leading to a gross supply. Part of that goes back into agriculture, your feed and your seed and so forth. And then a certain fraction of your net supply goes into all the other sectors. This is for biofuels, for industrial feedstocks, for food in the service sector, food in the household sector, and so forth. So these metabolic throughputs, these are extensive indicators. They're in scale to give us an idea of the scale or the scope of the system being assessed. And then from a metabolic perspective, we must always also contextualize these extensive indicators against a stable biophysical referent. For example, human activity, I mentioned also power capacity or land use, producing a set of further indicators, more qualitative, when we're given an idea of the identity of the system, your metabolic rates. So these are per unit indicators. We must always consider the 2. So let's, let me give you a concrete example, a little bit less abstract. Let's take a case study considering agriculture, the food system of the Netherlands. So I think many of you, if not most of you, have seen headlines in the news, in mainstream news sources. Agriculture exports hit record level. Dutch exports almost 100 billion in 2019. Or this one, which I really love, this tiny country feeds the world, that it's an agricultural giant with an organization of the agriculture sector worthy of reproduction. There's no doubt that the agricultural sector of the Netherlands is phenomenally technologically advanced, and there are many aspects to be repeated elsewhere. However, these narratives are misleading, especially from a metabolic perspective. They're misleading also from a security perspective, and I'll explain why. So why is this situation better? Important to understand, you remember the assertion that I started with, that the economy is not about producing goods and services. What the Netherlands does is not only agriculture, but agribusiness, to do a lot of import, processing to create higher value added goods, and then re-export. And the concern here from a strategic autonomy or from a security perspective is not the fact that they're relying on imports for their agriculture or agribusiness sector, but rather that they're compromising certain aspects of the organ of agriculture within the sector, and those aspects may be difficult to recover in the future if we're not aware about exactly what they are and make a decision about that. So from the societal metabolism lens, through that lens, from that approach, what we can do is open a discussion about the biophysical so-called metabolic logistics of the strategic autonomy of, in this case, the Netherlands or European food system in general. This is the last complicated slide. You have not to understand every aspect of it or read all of it. So on the right-hand side is your local system. This is your local socioeconomic system. This could be the Netherlands, for example. All 5 sectors you remember from earlier. On the left-hand side, a virtual system. This is one you're interfacing with through trade. You remember I mentioned different supply systems. So for example, livestock production systems, both domestic and external, again, interfaced with through trade. Different plant production systems, whether for feed or for direct consumption, leading to our gross supply, which again goes into all the different 5 sectors, goes into different purposes. What is the point? From when we're taking this toolkit of societal metabolism, when we begin quantifying characterizing both qualitative and quantitatively the different relations here, structural and functional, the stable elements, the fund elements, as well as the flows between them, we can derive insights such as the following. This is the EU 27 plus the UK and Norway. In the green is vegetable products, plant products, and in the middle is your animal products, and on the right-hand side, your feed products. The darker bars are what is imported, either directly or virtually meaning embedded in derived products. And then the lighter colored bars are what is domestically produced. This is in terms of mass. So on average, the average European country seen individually imports about 40% of its vegetable products, about 58% of its animal products, and about 83% of its feed products. What we would then do is develop a characterization. So what aspects of the organ of agriculture, of the food system, have been compromised in order to realize this modernization of agriculture? What security concerns or issues of strategic autonomy might be related to that? So a few conclusions, moving very quickly. Key indicators derived from this assessment from the perspective through the lens of societal metabolism must focus first and foremost, but not exclusively, on flow fund ratios. These are per unit ratios, so a flow versus a stable biophysical element. So contextualizing, basically what this means is contextualizing inputs and outputs against stable biophysical reference, such as human activity, land use, power capacity, or so forth. The set of indicators considered must be multidimensional, multi-scale, and multi-metric. This is because the usefulness of scientific advice depends on the priority given to the storyteller to legitimate but contrasting perceptions, aspirations, and purposes. This gets to the question previously about how to weight indicators, in the sense when you're dealing with a system that you view as organic rather than mechanical, only a divine being could weight the indicators. Lastly, last set of conclusions. The set of indicators considered must speak to concerns of environmental feasibility, economic viability, and social desirability, addressing first state and pressure variables, both for the social economic system and its environment, as well as interaction between the two. And second, it must consider impacts and drivers, later responses. I'm sorry, it's complicated. On the other hand, that's how diversity information is needed to handle a complex operation. This is the cockpit of an airliner. You see there are about 1,000 indicators, switches, and gauges. Unfortunately, at the moment in sustainability science, on the science policy interface, we tend to be operating in a mode more like this, with highly composite, highly commensurate aggregate indicators. I don't think any of you would like to fly in a plane like this. On the other hand, if everybody wants to play doctor, but nobody wants to go to medical school. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ansel, also for this very, very strong picture in the end, making the case for being better informed and for investing in the sustainability assessment. So we have, I think, still a bit of time before the coffee break for a couple of questions. I will start with one for Xenia. So how does safe and sustainable by design interact with the REACH framework and the work done by ECHA?
Okay, so this is really a question for ECHA, I suppose. But as I mentioned, the safe and sustainable by design is a pre-market approach. So it's something where the industry should ideally be thinking about this at the early stages. Right now, it's a research agenda, meaning that there's no legal link to the assessments done by ECHA. Of course, in the future, we don't know how it develops, and perhaps there may be a legal link, so those who have done the safe and sustainable by design can do it in a way that also interacts with the assessments under REACH. But I think maybe if there's somebody from ECHA here, they might be better at answering that, or maybe DG Environment.
Okay, thanks a lot, Xenia. So we heard about the need to not only assess pre-market, but also to monitor after new products have been inserted into use and into the environment. The question here we have is, should we do this also for other products that come new to the market, so novel foods, for example? So the example here given is cultivated meat or fish. Is there a need to monitor after market authorization what these products do in terms of food safety, but also in terms of maybe their environmental performance? Would you, I don't know, one of you would like to go for that?
Yeah, I think that this continuous risk assessment is mandatory now. In the past, environment were quite stable and innovation quite strong. And of course, this entails a challenge because we cannot assess everything, as I said at the beginning, at least for the environment. So you can work with representative scenarios to check whether or not there is a change. Then you move maybe to local context, and then post-market, because everything is changing anytime. So that's the reason. To what extent this, what I presented for environment, for agricultural assessment, would be equally applicable to food system? I think yes. In principle, in the current regulation, at least for GM plant, there is provision for post-market monitoring. So in principle, you can do that. I'm not sure to which extent the transitions would increase the level of interactions within the processes along the value chain as it does within the environment, in the open environment. But in principle, yes, this framework could be extended.
Thank you. And we have a question to Ansel regarding the scale of the system and the influence of this on the analysis. So what scale would you recommend to make a fair assessment if the analysis is heavily influenced by the scale of the system you choose? So city to globe.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. I think this is an important one. So I presented societal metabolism. In general, what we do is multi-scale integrated assessment or counting of societal and ecosystem metabolism, emphasis on the multi-scale aspect. So I would say a fair assessment necessarily needs to be multiple scale because different stakeholders have legitimate but contrasting concerns, and they choose legitimate but contrasting descriptive domains. So again, I'm sorry it's complicated, but I think the indicator dashboard, the information dashboard that we use on the science policy interface needs to be considering multiple scales simultaneously because not one is not fairer than the other.
Thanks a lot. We have a question on precision and digital farming and its role. So in terms of sustainable agricultural system. So in more general terms, who would like to answer that?
Yeah, again, I think there is no all technology or solutions should be used. I think the paradigm shift is that so far we have been working with a technological package, quite stable and very efficient. Pesticides are very efficient. And then to replace them, we need to combine various techniques. Everything is welcome. What matters is the contributions to the sustainability. So I would not conclude that ex ante we should move towards a technology or even a systems, conventional agriculture or organic farming or whatever. So, and that's why sustainability assessment tools are so important. Depending on the context, it's a different kind of combination we should be using. So yes, digital agriculture is fine as far as it is a good contributor to towards sustainability.
Can I make a quick comment? I would also say that we need to adopt a holistic view of the system, in the sense, oftentimes the perceived need to increase the digitalization of agriculture, the technological inputs, is driven from a perceived need to increase the yields. But from a holistic perspective, we need to have a discussion as a community, is this the direction we want to go? And it may very well be. On the other hand, for example, in the European Union, we've lost about 400,000 farms per year over the last decade. That's a statistic from a few years ago. We've gone from about 16 million down to 12 million. So along with that, we've had a complete reorientation of rural communities. Is that a change to our socioeconomic system within Europe that we see as desirable? It may or may not be, but I think we need to have a more holistic decision when deciding whether or not to increase the industrialization or the technological inputs or digitalization of agriculture.
Thanks a lot. Maybe along these lines of the holistic assessment, so how do you assess the sustainability of pesticides and the pesticides use and of the alternatives that might be out there? Would like to take that one. So how do you assess the sustainability of pesticide use and the alternatives? So also maybe with a view on how do we do this holistically. Xenia, would you like to take that? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, I think this comes back to the overall ambition of reducing harm to people and the planet. So it's really about reducing the overall impacts from the various stressors. So I liked, and I very much agree with the comments that whatever works to reduce the harm is fine. I mean, if it's biological methods, if it's a diversification of the crop diversity, if it's precision farming, all works, but it has to be assessed against this overall impact on the environment. So I think that's actually a little bit of a challenge, because it requires that we understand what is the carrying capacity, for instance, of our systems, and their ecosystems vary, and that's really where we have some knowledge gaps that we need to fill to be able to answer those questions and set up the metrics for it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think, of course, in principle, with this sustainability framework, you can compare scenarios based on pesticide use and alternatives. And so, in principle, you can use whatever scenarios and compare. So this multi-criteria assessment. The point which is difficult is not to assess, to compare in the current context, and to look at how it would evolve over time, which is one of the challenges when you set up a sustainability framework, how we account for the long-term effect and all the interactions that cannot be assessed up front, because some new technology, new practices, or new environment would occur. Again, this is why we need this continuous process. Also, there is some environmental considerations, more socio-economic. To what extent, which is a bit tricky for technology, to what extent a technology might lock in further transition, which is something maybe we can discuss later in the panel discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we have to give you time to enjoy your coffee break, so we will stop here. A big applause, please, for also the second round of speakers. Welcome back. Welcome back to the third part of our morning session here, and I'm happy to now lead over to Tobin Robinson from EFSA, Head of the Plant Health and Pesticide Residues Unit, to moderate the panel discussion here, and the panel will look into possible ways forward for co-designing best practices for the sustainability assessment. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, good morning. Welcome to this session, this panel session that we have for you today to continue the discussion on creating a framework for sustainability assessment. We hope to make this session a lively one for you. So already, I would remind you once again, please use the chat that we have to send your comments and questions to us. We'll do our best to take those during the panel discussion or to give you answers to those questions that you feel are important, you'd like to hear answering. Also, please, in the chat, use the facility for liking other people's questions and comments. Give them a thumbs up. That also helps us direct the questions that we'll be posing to the panel, to those that you, as an audience, feel are the most important ones. So what we have is a panel of 5 members. We have 3 of them physically present with us today. We have another 2 panel members who will be online, joining us from distance. We have a couple of questions already lined up for our panelists. But as I say, as we go along, we'll be very happy to take your questions, integrate that into what's going on. So the theme of the conference that we have here is, as you know, One Health, and One Health serving as a bridge across food safety, nutrition, and sustainability. That's what we're trying to discuss in the conference in general today. For those of you that participated in the first part of this morning's session, you will have heard a number of presentations specifically directed at the sustainability part of that. We continue that discussion through our panel discussion here. Sustainability in that context of One Health, food safety, and nutrition as well. So, also, you will have heard one of the key messages, I think, shared by our executive director yesterday is that this isn't simply a discussion that we're having. This is not simply something coming from EFSA. This is an event that has been co-created with our sister agencies with a very clear aim and an acknowledgement that this is a task, sustainability, of all the agencies involved, so EFSA, ECHA, EMA, EEA. I hope you're all familiar with them. We all have a role to play in addressing this complex question, but it goes far beyond what the agencies themselves can contribute to this, and the agencies' contributions rely very much upon partnership, collaboration, co-creation with all stakeholders with an interest in food and the food chain. And we're not just talking professionals, it goes also beyond that to consumers, so the whole European population, everybody who eats food. So part of our considerations is not just what can we do, but also how can we involve everybody that needs to be involved in placing forward the One Health concept, and as I say, this morning's discussion, particularly the sustainability part of that. So we have 5 panelists. I'm very happy to introduce you to our 5 panelists. With us on the platform, we have Dr. Hanna Tuomisto. She is an associate professor in sustainable food systems at the University of Helsinki, where she leads the Future Sustainable Food Systems Research Group. Welcome. We also have Dr. Roberta Sonino with us today. She's a professor in sustainable food systems at the Centre for Environmental Sustainability at the University of Surrey in UK, where she works particularly across the research and policy interface. So again, a kind of broader aspect on and an important one of solving this problem altogether. We also have with us on the platform Dr. Antoine Messéan. Welcome. Antoine is a research manager at the INRAE, the National Institute for Agriculture Food and the Environment in France. He has a background in agronomy and statistics and leads coordination unit addressing ecological impacts of innovation in plant production. So welcome, Antoine. Remotely, as I said, we have two further panel members. So we have Dr. Andrea Hagio is with us. She's an expert on agriculture and agroecological systems. She works at the European Environmental Agency, where she's coordinating activities related to food systems. So welcome, Andrea. And finally, our fifth member of our panel is Dr. Serenella Sala from the European Commission's Joint Research Centre, where she's Deputy Head of Unit on Land Resources in the Directorate D on Sustainable Resources, where she's also Team Leader of Life Cycle Assessment Group. And welcome, Serenella. So, the first question that we have for our panel, and address this one by one to our panelists, is which are the relevant drivers, inhibitors, and catalyzers shaping the transition to sustainability? And if we start with Hannah, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think only yesterday, especially at Jessica Fanso's presentation, keynote talk, we covered many of these drivers and the reasons or the sustainability issues that the food systems are facing, and it's of course very clear how relevant food systems are to many environmental impacts. Like food systems contribute about 80% to many of the planetary boundaries, and now you saw that for climate change in Europe, about 36% are because of food systems. But that at the same time, environmental change is also affecting food systems and agriculture, and that's already now visible. So we can see the effects of climate change on food or agriculture productivity. Also in Europe, we have dry summers and then very wet summers, and especially in Africa and elsewhere. So then it's kind of not anymore something that we sustainability scientists would be warning about the humanity that we need to act, but now we can actually already see the effects of environmental changes, and we must act. And this is also related to the, of course, health, malnutrition, and the increasing malnutrition because of these pandemics, and now the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and the food crisis caused by that. It's again something that sustainability scientists have been warning about, the risks of these globalized food systems, and how vulnerable they are for many shocks, environmental shocks, but also these kind of wars, etc. And now again, we are only starting to act when we have to, and so basically, hopefully, these are also the catalyzers in a way that push us to think about the sustainability of food systems in general, and thinking about how we could maybe increase also the localized food production, and that we wouldn't be only relying on imports. And then also maybe from the health aspects, like one of would it be then catalyzer is this, there was a discussion about whether EFSA should also consider from the health perspective these environmental issues, and there is this new, or it's not anymore very new, but still relatively new, this concept of planetary health, so framing the environmental issues also to human health issues, so they are not, environmental issues are not only something that happens somewhere there, but they are actually health issues and affecting us. So yeah, so then, okay, inhibitors, yeah, I guess the inhibitors are really the short-term economic targets that we just think about what is the economically most feasible way of producing food, and not considering these sustainability issues. And then, of course, other issues are the habits and how difficult it is to change human behavior and institutional systems, etc. So maybe I will leave here.
Thank you, Anna. Roberta, please.
Yes. Okay, drivers, I think we heard a lot this morning. I'm not going to repeat what previous speakers have already said so well, but one thing I want to stress in terms of drivers is that there's a political momentum now around the food system transformation that we can possibly afford not to build on. The acceptance, there's a widespread acceptance that we need to act. And as Hannah just mentioned, the war in Ukraine, COVID, that demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that our food system is in a state of structural crisis. We need to act. Business as usual is no longer an option. Let's remember that over 100 countries last year committed, after the UN Food System Summit, committed themselves to transform their food system towards sustainability. Let's try to make the most of the political momentum we have here. Inhibitors, what's stopping us? I'm going to use one word. For me, what's really stopping us is fragmentation. Fragmentation of policy, fragmentation of knowledge, fragmentation of governance. And the three things often go together. Briefly explained, policy is still very much dominated by siloed ways of working. We still have a tendency not to connect food with other policy domains and policy priorities: climate change, health, trade, social and gender equity, biodiversity. We need integrated food policies. Fragmentation of knowledge. We just launched last week as a high-level expert group of the European Commission a report called Everyone at the Table, Transforming Food Systems by Connecting Science, Policy and Society. Hannah was also a member of the expert group. I see Jacqueline Burse in the audience, who was also a member of the expert group. We really reflected for over a year over the fragmentation of knowledge we are still facing when it comes to food systems. There's no comprehensive and publicly available tool to collect, integrate, but also disaggregate data from different stakeholders on the environment, society, health, governance. So we need to work to make sure that we rethink the meaning, value, and understanding of knowledge in relation to food systems. Last but not least, a fragmentation in terms of disconnections between governance scales. In my own experience, in my own research, I have been writing a lot about exciting developments occurring at the global level. We can think about the EU Farm to Fork strategy as a really good example of global action. There's a lot happening at the local level. My own work is very much about urban food systems. Cities have pioneered very innovative food policies, very integrated food policies. But we are also facing a striking inertia by national governments. I cannot believe how quiet and inactive national governments have remained on food system transformation. So creating a disconnect in terms of governance. Finally, on catalyzers, we heard a lot this morning about systems thinking, systemic approaches. Finally, this is another great achievement of the last few years. We are realizing the importance of thinking and acting systemically. Now, we need to make sure that systems thinking is embedded in the governance context. And here again, I want to go back to the report we launched last week. We need a stronger and more coordinated society, policy, and research interface ecosystem. an ecosystem that can help us to identify clear pathways towards the paradigm shift we need, an ecosystem that can help us to devise cost-effective solutions. We need to be realistic in the kind of solutions we propose, an SPI ecosystem that can help us to mobilize evidence at multiple scales and across the entire food system.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Roberta. Antoine, could you share with us your thoughts on this?
Would very much support what was just said about fragmentation. I think accepting to act and fragmentations are two key issues. I would like just to mention that we need to understand where we are coming from, why we are in such a situation. And to me, we are in a lock-in situation. The current mainstream agri-food system has been evolving around the limited number of commodity crops and products, and everything around, so the so-called socio-technical regime, meaning policy, industry, regulation, education, and research has been evolving the same way and have been organized with the institutions that has been built on, while we need a brand new systems, as you said. And how so we move from current, with the same people. So we use EFSA, Commission, member states, the same institutions, and the institutions should evolve, get out of the box, which is a big challenge, and we are all reluctant to change. And but we need to understand that everybody should change, not just farmers, not just policymakers, researchers, education should change. And that's, to me, something that science should also look at. And I see that some are looking at how it works. It's not that to blame anybody in there. So it's easy to blame, it's a commission, it's industry, it's farmer, they don't want to change. No, everybody should change. And first, scientists should change the way they are doing research. So, and that, yeah, I just put that for the time being, but to me it's a crucial role. And we need to do that all together and at the same time. Now, I'll just leave it for discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Antoine. So now I'd like to bring in our two panel members who are online. So Andrea, please.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so many things have been already said. I'd like to emphasize one more percentage fact that agriculture covers at least 40% of the land in Europe, and it affects also seas and marine areas. So we have not spoken a lot about fisheries and aquaculture. So it's very much dependent on land, natural resources, much more maybe than mobility and energy systems. So it's very complex. It's very much linked to people also. So it's very much depends on people's behavior. And achieving change can be done in hugely diverse ways. So for enablers, I would mention three things: changing mindsets, develop a shared vision, and as it was said already, building on the momentum of the awareness of crisis and urgency. I think this is really important. I mention one thing that has not been said, maybe, that recovering the broken relationship of people with the food system and with nature in general could enhance changes in behavior. So it could enhance emerging new values, change social norms towards sustainable consumption. Learning fast and trying new things is important, in which it was also said that knowledge transfer is very important between all actors, ranging from science, policy, and also including businesses, investors, financing institutions, and advisory services. And on the other hand, sharing knowledge only won't change behaviors. Also, financial measures are important, for example, taxation. And another thing is revaluation of farmers, their inclusion in the core processes, also traditional local knowledge, and reestablishment of direct relationships between consumers and producers that is also linked with our connection with the food system, so consumers' connection with the whole process. Yeah, integration is challenging, but it's really needed, and it can help to prioritize those options where we can find co-benefits. And assessment systems should be key in identifying these. Also, to find trade-offs, when we find trade-offs, it has to be well communicated, and solutions have to be proposed for that. As it was mentioned that changing is difficult, we are reluctant for change. So for that, it can be helped by policy and by knowledge transfer to for example, enhance risk management and to explain these options and future opportunities also. Another thing that came up with that foresight can help to include people and to broaden up the discussion, to imagine different solutions and to embrace the diversity of solutions. And for inhibitors, I would mention that lock-ins that was already mentioned also, and the trade-offs between short-term objectives and long-term resilience. Also related to reluctance of change is difficulties to roll out innovative approaches, and also in terms of our economic model that could be think about how to think not only about economic interests, but also focusing on well-being of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And our fifth member, Serenella, please.
Thank you. So, of course, I subscribe everything that has been said, including and probably also, let's say, with specific reference on the fragmentation, because something that I think it's quite important also in the support that we need to give to science, to policy from science is really in helping connecting the dots, so helping overcoming this fragmentation. I want to touch upon another aspect actually here, more on the behavior element, and not the behavior just of the consumer, but the behavior of all the actors along the food system. Actually, there are specific actions that can be made by retailers, but those that are dealing with the logistics. For example, one of the elements that is often neglected is that we are more and more relying on cold chains for transporting our goods, because we are relying on more pre-prepared food, on frozen food. So on one hand, there is, let's say, the easiness for the consumer to consume, and on the other hand is a complexity of the food chain and the implication of this food chain that is enlarging and extending. So one element is really to identify solutions that can be applicable, taking into account really all the actors there, and not just the focus on the producer side on one end or on the consumer on the other hand. Another important barrier for me is anyway the awareness. On one hand, the awareness of the bottleneck or the key players in the food system, one indicator at the time, because we might have, for a specific sustainability dimension, a specific role for primary producer, but then for another one, we might have another actor. So for example, if we look at the food waste, We cannot say that it's an awareness issue because I think people know that they are generating this food waste. They are also paying for their food and then they are wasting. But then there are other elements that are really not giving sufficient importance to the food, and also creating then a situation in which really we are now basically throwing away almost 1/3 of what we are buying. But on the other hand, instead, there are certain areas in which still we miss an awareness. So as I mentioned before, an awareness of the paradoxes that we might have in place. Paradoxes between increase on the packaging of the food on one end, for example, to have smaller portion and then potentially reduce the food waste, and instead the material intensity of the overall food system. I think you experienced as well as consumer sometimes that you are offered the packaging in which it's more the weight of the packaging compared to the weight of what is inside, because maybe there are 2 slices of an apple offered you already peeled and prepared. So I think one barrier, as I said, it's really on the awareness side. On the other side, I see really a cultural shift for scientists, for policymakers, and for consumers. Because if I know that I have not to waste something, why I'm wasting that? This is really culture, mindset is not knowledge. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. So, Roberto, I noticed that in your intervention you used the term ecosystem. It's a term that we've used frequently this last year in EFSA for describing the community that we want to engage with and that have a role, in fact, in food safety one way or another. And if we talk about the ecosystem in that context for sustainability, I think the people, the institutions involved is going to be a much broader church. I see in the questions that we've received a very pertinent one along these lines. So getting all stakeholders from society at the table is often difficult because of a lack of trust, for example, between farmers and NGOs. So how can we get everybody at the table and contributing?
I would say that it's increased dialogues and not only providing information, but really having these kind of stakeholder dialogues at different levels with the language that, for example, farmers can understand, that and also that they can learn from each other. That has been seen as a good way of implementing things at farms.
Okay, thank you. Serenella, maybe you'd like also to give us your opinion on that. How to get people involved?
Yes, that I think it's something that more and more we are already observing. I think it's not only in future to involve, but already via the different and evolving governance of the food system. So consumers are more and more aware. In certain cases are niches of them more informed, but also more active in addressing certain challenges in relation to the food system sustainability. So I would say that really one element is on the transparency side. So the transparency of the assessment we are conducting, but also of the information that is delivered to the consumer. Now, in the framework legislation for the farm to fork is now under discussion, a sustainability labeling. For me, that is one possible way to engage, not only to deliver a number or deliver indicators to the consumer or to the actors in the supply chain, but to engage in a co-creation of the future food system. Because whatever indicator will be part of this sustainability labeling, that means that it will be the result of the engagement with the actors across the supply chain, that the food chain that should bake the information that are there, but also an engagement with the consumer. Because as I mentioned before, in this cultural shift, being then aware of the type of information we can get from this labeling, and how this can nudge our behavior towards more sustainable behavior, that I think will be a game changer if it will be implemented as advocated.
Excellent, thank you. So certainly co-creation as a way of getting meaningful engagement and participation. I had an interesting discussion this morning over breakfast, I have to say, with a group of colleagues who will remain nameless. They said yesterday afternoon, after enjoying the conference, they, as you would expect, went to dinner together. A very animal protein heavy dinner is what they described it as being, recognizing themselves that maybe this wasn't the most sustainable of options that they took after hearing about sustainability for an afternoon. An interesting challenge, because these are people with a background in food, okay? So they know what it takes to make food. They know a lot about how food is produced and put on their plate. And yet they themselves recognize that maybe their own behavior is not so easy to modify. So how are we going to change the behavior of consumers?
Yeah, I could also share an experience from yesterday dinner time where we were with Jacqueline looking for a Belgian restaurant, and we checked many restaurants and checked the menu, and there wasn't really much vegetarian options or even fish. It was like each meal, like everything had meat, some sort of meat in it. So yeah, but that's the issue, the culture. And then actually, yeah, Jacqueline was telling about the project where they educate people to cook, like cooking classes. Was that in Asia or somewhere? But I think we need these also in Europe. So we need to learn how to cook from beans and using vegetables elsewhere also than only in salads, and how to make sustainable food, because our food culture in many countries, like here, it's very meat heavy. So it's very difficult to change the food culture. But then, yeah, of course, another approach is this development of meat alternatives that try to mimic the foods that we are used to eating. So of course, that's another solution. But I think we need both. We need to also learn to make new types of foods from vegetables.
Okay. Roberta, please.
Yeah, just to give one possible concrete solution here. For me, we should be rethinking school meals. So it's another area where I've done a lot of research in my career, in my past. Let's try to look at the school meal not as a moment when children need to queue up at the counter to ingest food, but as an educational moment where they actually learn something about the connections between food and the planet, food and health. And there are very encouraging signs from regions, countries, cities that have adopted the so-called whole school food approach. So just one example of something we could do if we had a more enabling policy environment.
Excellent, very good. Antoine, please.
Yeah, which solution? I think it's multidimensional, and also we should acknowledge that it would take time to get out from the current lock-in. Concretely, I think we discussed assessment tools before. I think we should promote among every single citizen. I've been struck when I've used an app on my own estimations of my contribution to the emission of greenhouse gases. There is applications, and I was struck. And so then you realize that you need to change your way of life. It might be not sufficient because you need to be passionate for that, maybe. So, second case, I think everybody, as I said, everybody is concerned. So coming back to agency, you mentioned what they can do. I think agencies could try, I don't know, I appreciate that it's not easy, get out of the box. You have a mandate, and coming back to the discussion on risk assessment, you have to risk assess a given innovation. And you are framed by that. But why not get out of the box and while complying with the mandate to warn and to provide the global picture about the implications? We are talking about, we are assessing a pesticide, but pesticides are part of a system. They might lock in the emergence of alternatives, or they might drive a bit of a pathway. Understand that it's part of a science, but agency, I think, would be very much welcome to do that. Last example at the very local level about consumers. In the Diver Impact project I'm coordinating, we have 25 case studies across Europe. In Sweden, they're starting saying, we want to develop more legumes. And they tried the business as usual way, looking at the field level, improve the yield, and then they just stop and say, we need to change. And they organize a food jam. So with consumers, citizens, cooks, and then discuss cooking all together, discussing about the issue to frame, well, what we like at EFSA, kind to frame the problem formulation. And that's part of the game. Of course, it's not just one case, it's not just 25, how we spread, but that's solution. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to come back to in fact, the presentations of this morning and really the theme of this session, which is designing a framework for sustainability assessment. And to ask you, the panelists, when designing such a framework, what are the must-haves and what are the nice-to-haves in terms of characteristics of such a framework for carrying out sustainability assessment? In particular, I think the audience would be interested in having the feedback from those of the panelists who haven't presented on that this morning. So maybe, Andrea, if we could start with you.
Thank you. So I'd like to highlight a few points based on some keywords like processes enabling transition, forward-looking, multi-level, multi-scale assessments, and people and nature. So I think an assessment framework that is for sustainability transition assessment needs to capture transition dynamics, so the processes that can enable the transition that can lead to systemic changes. It cannot focus only on status and pressure indicators like traditional frameworks many times. And foresight approaches can help to identify what are these approaches. So this is the first question, what are these processes? Then the next challenge is how to monitor them, but also that these can be bottom-up initiatives, so not mainstream processes linked to emerging solutions, innovations, and traditional frameworks can easily outweigh these things. So it links to also what Serenella said, that the framework should be change-oriented, and also the reference values, the boundaries should be based on forward-looking approaches. So it has to be proactively tracking emerging trends. So it cannot be built on business as usual system characteristics. And this leads us to the importance of multi-scale, multi-level assessments that was mentioned by many today. And also with active participation of all stakeholders, of course. The challenge here is how to link general frameworks with smaller scale assessments. that include more contextual information. So this multi-scale, multi-level assessment, I think, is very relevant in terms of including these emerging innovations, but also another important point is that assessing impacts on biodiversity, because it needs different levels, smaller scale assessments, and so impacts on local, on-field biodiversity, on landscape level, and on global biodiversity, and impacts of different production systems mainly. So from the production side, the local conditions are very important, maybe a bit less for the further downstream processes along the line. The challenge is here to have a strategic vision to assess the system along these different production and processing processes. So what combination of mixtures of different systems can provide a balance to remain within planetary boundaries while still, of course, producing food for people. And also, last point is that the role of different elements of biodiversity in providing resilience should be also included, I think. And for that also, multi-level is important.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And Roberta, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think this question has really two big sub-questions. One is about what to assess, but there's also an important dimension about how to assess. So when it comes to what, as everybody has pointed out, we just need to refocus actions away from efficiency metrics. So metrics linked, for example, to output per area of land under cultivation for the supply side, or volume and price of calories available for the demand side. These are too narrow measures. So if, as the title of this conference entails, we want food systems that deliver on both human and planetary health, as my predecessor has pointed out, we need to assess environmental impacts, diets, nutrition, and land uses, and all at multiple scales. But I want to be a bit provocative about the how, because there's a pervasive use of terms such as metrics and indicators. And my key message here is that metrics and indicators are not neutral tools. They are ingrained in very established governance trajectories. They create specific ways of knowing that focus on the end product. So through metric and indicators, we know a lot about the end product. We don't know anything about the process. And here, I'm actually also addressing one of the questions we just received from Ciro, I think, about fragmentation of markets. Yes, markets are fragmented because of power dynamics. And metrics and indicators tell us about the end product, not about the role of power in creating that fragmentation. So my main answer here is to always keep in mind that what, how, and why we choose to assess and who has the right to assess are deeply political issues. So what do we need to do? In my view, and I have been writing about this lately as well, what we really need to do is to focus on the development of truly participatory methodologies. Methodologies that are able to draw upon the experiential knowledge of citizens. Citizens have a lot of knowledge and understanding of food dynamics. They know how to collect, map, and analyze data. And I think we need to make a concerted effort to develop truly participatory methodology that build on that kind of knowledge. So I'm sure lots of people in this room have been involved in the establishment of living labs, which now seem to be the solution, almost taken for granted solution to co-designing and co-implementing pilot actions. Well, they're not always, because there are many communities who will never come to our living labs. As researchers, we need to have the courage to actually go there and speak to them and build on their knowledge, their embodied experience of the food system. So my final sentence here, we need frameworks that are flexible, as everybody has said, simple, that can be co-utilized, so not only co-designed with stakeholders. But my other key message here, and I think somebody before me has already said it, we also need frameworks that can capture context-specific information and priorities, because we are not going to develop truly progressive food policies without knowing about what the context-dependent needs and priorities are.
Excellent, thank you very much. Hannah, please.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to remember is the urgency. So the Sustainable Development Goals are set for 2030, so that's only less than 8 years' time. And so we cannot develop perfect framework, but we need to just develop something that it is functional and solution-oriented, and really, of course, it needs to be kind of robust in a way that it's not leading to some kind of like misleading, or that something that it's considering all the sustainability aspects, and while we are improving something, it's not then harming something else. But I just know I have been involved in development of this product environmental footprint guidelines. So I was also working at the JRC in like 2014 and 15 in developing those guidelines, and I know how challenging it is only for the environmental sustainability. And this product environmental footprint development process is still not finished, and it has been running for quite far. So then there are lots of issues and different interest groups. Of course, that's a very co-creative process, which is good, but then it's also like even more difficult to find the consensus when there are lots of different interest groups involved. But then when we also take these social and economic aspects with these environmental aspects, then it becomes even more complicated. And yeah, there have been already really good discussion during this session about this, the weaknesses of life cycle assessment, which is product-oriented approach, and how it can give kind of misleading results in the sense that it may show that the environmental impact is very low per unit of product because it's very high productive system, but then it has detrimental impacts at the local level to the biodiversity and the local waterways, etc. So then how to combine these kind of approaches, that it's not only this standard life cycle assessment, but then considering also the farm level impacts, and then also these issues of that it cannot be only focusing on the environmental impact, but also thinking about the other benefits of having these local food systems, like we already discussed earlier, but about the other risks of globalized food systems. And okay, the biodiversity already came in there, but then maybe also about the links with the food systems and other sectors. So we cannot only look at the agriculture or food production in isolation, because it's also linked to other sectors like the land use. So then also the scale, like do we look at the product or the farm or the country or the global impacts, and then we should also consider the other ways of using land, for example. Then also energy sector is related to food systems. And also considering the fact that agriculture is not only producing food, but many other materials as well. So yeah, it's a multi-process system. And then, okay, maybe about the implementation. So that's also, of course, what we researchers do. We developed all sorts of models and frameworks and assessment methods, but then the links to the implementation. So how do we? There may be even different methods needed at the different levels of the food system. So for farmers, food producers, policymakers, we need different types of tools and methods as well. But then, like how these could be designed so that they really help with the change and implementing these sustainable practices. And that's the SAFA method. It had the governance also included in there. So maybe that could be something to think about.
Excellent, thank you, Anna. Antoine, in 30 seconds.
No, not much to add. Flexibility, of course, participatory approaches. I would just add adaptability over time. Over to metrics, I do agree that we are still assessing sustainability with the framework of a paradigm of the conventional system. So that's where participatory approach are nice. So people would say, okay, it's the number of people in good health instead of yield that we should be using. So we need to correct. But adaptability, to me, I think there is one issue. I have no solution. When we are, so we won't move from the current situation to a sustainable system. A stable system was a stable the system have been quite stable so far, and we won't get a stable system, so new one, a good one. That's a dream. It will always be dynamic. And my content that we should be adaptive enough so as we get out from the paradigm of optimality. We have always been optimizing, and especially scientists love. And therefore, to what extent a solution, an alternative solution today might, again, prevent long-term sustainability. So, and how we do that? Of course, we need this long-term assessment, but at the same time, the context will change. So anyway, so you can make scenarios, try to improve the tools, long-term assessment, but at the end of the day, you would have to react anytime and change and be able to say, okay, I need a detour. It might not be the optimal solution today, but on the long term, it would be more resilient. So it's not that clear, but I think for sure, researchers, scientists, and together with policymakers should work on this issue.
Excellent, Antoine, thank you very much. I see time is racing. I would like to summarize for you some of the points made from this discussion. In fact, there's a lot has come out of it, and as I'm sure you can tell, we could be sitting here for many hours if we were given the chance. What can we say? Sustainability analysis, and we're talking about the processes, procedures, the methods for carrying out sustainability analysis. There are things that we can draw on from our experience in the risk assessment, and we have many years of experience as a community on how to carry out risk assessment. There's stuff that we can take, but there are things that we're going to have to add, improvise, invent to complement that, to get us where we want. One of the clear principles that has come from our experience in risk assessment, and again I speak as a community, is the need for transparency in whatever we put in place. It has to be clear to everybody what we're doing and therefore how we've come about whatever conclusions we come to. One solution fits all. Don't even dare to dream of something like that. It's going to be complicated. The clear message is it's a very, very complicated problem, and therefore the solutions are not going to be simple. So a range of methods and approaches will be needed, carried out by a range of different people with different expertise. And the solutions we've heard yesterday and today will be not one solution. It will require a lot of different approaches to address this issue of sustainability. Whilst, I mean, we're kind of crazy, huh? We want to do sustainability whilst maintaining food safety, whilst providing nutrition, whilst doing this against an economic background which is already difficult, whilst providing for all of the social aspects linked to food and food production. And to do all of that, and as was mentioned, somehow managing the trade-offs between all of those different priorities, that will have to be made. We won't be able to do all of these things without some trade-offs. So real challenges ahead, maybe for the risk managers, not for the risk assessors if we're lucky. Whatever we produce needs to be proactive, it needs to be forward-looking, it needs to be future-proof. We need to have flexibility in it because there are lots of things that are going to happen that we won't be able to anticipate now. As somebody who's been involved in crisis planning, I never have sat in a room where we imagined a situation that we've experienced these last 2 years for COVID. None of us had that imagination. And I don't see why we will be lacking that imagination going into the future as well. So we need to have adaptable, flexible methodologies that can cope with the unexpected. We're going to need to reuse the existing systems because we can't afford to invent stuff from scratch. There's loads of expertise already in our systems. We need to adapt them to these new challenges. And we need to reconnect people with food to get them understanding how their food is produced and what they can do in their choices to contribute to this big sustainability issue. Those are just a few of the points I brought out of today's discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this excellent sharing of their thoughts. And with that, I hand you back to our chair, Anne-Catherine, please.
Thank you very much, Tobin, and thank you very much to all the panelists, remotely and in the room, for this very interesting discussion. I think the challenges have been set out this morning for fostering sustainability, for moving forward in the transition of the food system, and for doing that with the sustainability assessment framework in place to inform all the actors of the food system concerning their behavior change. And I think one last message, in addition to what you already said, Tobin, is that we need to collaborate, we need to work together, everybody, and we need to do that also with an open mind, with being able to integrate the different approaches and bringing together the best of what we all do, with the common goal of moving the food system in the right direction. And I think the vision was mentioned by one participant, and I think this is something that might still be lacking, or a positive narrative about what is a sustainable food system, how does it look like at the different levels, be it EU or be it the local level. And maybe that is something that we also can work on and create this common vision, common narrative to have a positive future and to have food on the table, basically. So with this, we finish this session. Thank you very much also to the audience here in the room and connected remotely. So we now have a lunch break, but there will be actually virtual lounge that will open within kind of 10 minutes or so, where you can continue exchanging with some of our speakers and panelists today. And the session otherwise will resume at, or the One Planet track to be precise, will resume at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you very much and enjoy the break.